December 1950. Chosin Reservoir, 40 below zero. You've heard the statistics. You know about the frozen Tootsie Rolls, the frostbite casualties, the fighting withdrawal. You know that 15,000 UN troops were surrounded by 120,000 Chinese soldiers in the most brutal conditions warfare has ever seen. But here's what the history books gloss over. While the Marines were fighting their way out of that frozen hell, one man made a decision that changed everything we thought we knew about what happened at Chosin. His name was Technical Sergeant Elmer Bender, and he did something so extraordinary, so against orders, that it would haunt the Marine Corps for decades. This is the story they don't tell you in the documentaries. November 27, 1950. The 1st Marine Division had just walked into the biggest trap of the Korean War. General Song Shilun's 9th Army Group had been hiding in those mountains for weeks, waiting. 120,000 Chinese soldiers, dug in, frozen in place, some literally frozen to death in their foxholes before the battle even started. That's how committed they were. The temperature had dropped to 35 below zero. Your spit would freeze before it hit the ground. Morphine syrettes were useless, frozen solid. Blood plasma, same thing. The Marines didn't know it yet, but they were about to fight two enemies, the Chinese Army and the worst winter conditions American troops had ever faced in combat. Technical Sergeant Elmer Bender was with Fox Company, 2nd Battalion, 7th Marines, 32 years old, a veteran of the Pacific Campaign. He'd seen Peleliu, seen Okinawa. He thought he knew what hell looked like. Fox Company had been assigned to hold Toktong Pass, a critical mountain pass that would serve as the escape route for the entire division once things went south. And things were about to go very, very south. On the night of November 27th, the Chinese attacked. Not with artillery barrages or air support. They came in human waves, blowing bugles, screaming, hundreds of them pouring down from the ridgelines. Fox Company had 240 men. They were hit by over 1,000 Chinese soldiers in the first assault alone. The fighting was hand-to-hand. Bayonets, rifle butts, entrenching tools. The kind of fighting that doesn't make it into the official reports because it's too ugly, too personal. By dawn, Fox Company had held. Barely. They'd lost 20 men killed, dozens wounded. The Chinese left over 450 dead on the slopes around their position. But here's what made that first night different. Bender noticed something. In the chaos of the night fighting, several Marines had been killed in forward positions, out beyond the main perimeter. When dawn came and the Chinese pulled back, those bodies were still out there, just 50, 60 yards away, in no man's land. The standard procedure was clear. You don't risk the living for the dead. You hold your position, you wait for relief, and you recover remains when it's tactically feasible. But Bender looked at those frozen bodies and made a different calculation. He knew what would happen when night fell again. The Chinese would be back, and those Marines would be lost forever, buried under snow and new casualties, or worse, used by the Chinese as bait for an ambush. So at 900 hours, against the protests of his lieutenant, Bender took 4 volunteers and went out there, in broad daylight, in full view of Chinese positions. They crawled through the snow, dragging shelter halves behind them. It took them 40 minutes to reach the first body. Private First Class Robert Ezel, 19 years old, from Tennessee. Frozen solid. They wrapped him in the shelter half and started dragging him back. The Chinese didn't shoot, not at first. Bender realized why. They were watching, trying to understand what these Americans were doing. Using the confusion as cover, they got Ezel back to the lines. Then Bender did it again. And again, 4 trips, 4 bodies recovered. By the time they brought in the last Marine, Chinese snipers had figured out what was happening and opened fire. Bender took a round through his parka, missed his ribs by an inch. He made it back. When Captain William Barber, Fox Company commander, demanded to know what the hell Bender thought he was doing violating orders, Bender said something that became legendary in the company. "Sir, I just spent 3 years in the Pacific digging up our dead from jungle graves because we left them behind the first time. I'm not doing that again." Barber didn't court-martial him. He should have. Instead, he watched what happened to his company over the next 4 days. November 28th. Second night, the Chinese came again. Bigger assault, better coordinated. Fox Company was now down to 220 effectives. They held, but just barely. More casualties, more bodies in forward positions. And at dawn on the 29th, Bender went out again. This time 6 volunteers went with him. Word had spread. The Marines had started calling them Bender's body detail. It sounds crazy. It was crazy. But here's what the textbooks don't tell you. Morale at Chosin was collapsing. Not because the Marines were losing, they weren't, but because the cold was killing more men than the Chinese. Frostbite was claiming hundreds. Men were losing fingers, toes, entire feet to the cold. The psychological impact of watching your buddies freeze to death, of knowing you might be next, was devastating. Standard military doctrine says you can't let sentiment interfere with tactical decisions. But Bender understood something the textbooks don't. Sometimes sentiment is the tactical decision. Every time Bender's detail brought back a body, every time they risked their lives for a Marine who was already gone, it sent a message to everyone still alive. We don't leave our people behind. Not for the Chinese. Not for the cold, not ever. The effect was electric. Fox Company's cohesion, which should have shattered under those conditions, actually strengthened. Men fought harder knowing that even if they fell, they weren't going to be abandoned to that frozen mountain. By December 1st, Fox Company had been holding Toktong Pass for 5 days. They were down to 82 men still capable of fighting. They'd been hit by 7 major Chinese assaults. They'd inflicted over 1,000 enemy casualties. And Bender had made 14 trips into no man's land. 14 bodies recovered. Then came the breakout. The entire 1st Marine Division was fighting its way south, and they had to come through Toktong Pass, through Fox Company's position. If Fox collapsed, 10,000 Marines would be trapped. On December 2nd, the relief column finally reached Fox Company. Lieutenant Colonel Raymond Davis and his 1st Battalion, 7th Marines had fought through 7 miles of Chinese positions to get there. When Davis walked into Fox Company's perimeter, he couldn't believe what he saw. 82 Marines, most of them wounded, standing in defensive positions. 48 Marine bodies recovered and laid out in rows, covered in ponchos, ready for evacuation. 0 Marines left behind. Davis, a Medal of Honor recipient himself, later wrote in his report, "The tactical achievement of holding Toktong Pass was remarkable. The moral achievement of maintaining unit cohesion under those conditions was unprecedented." But here's where the story gets complicated. After Chosin, after the division made it to Hungnam and evacuated, after the headlines and the medals and the parades, the Marine Corps did something unusual. They classified most of Bender's after-action reports. Not because he'd done anything wrong, but because what he'd done couldn't become official doctrine. You can't teach disobey orders to recover dead bodies at Quantico. You can't make that standard operating procedure. It only worked because of who Bender was, the specific circumstances of Chosin, and the desperate need for morale in that frozen hellscape. If you tried to make it policy, you'd get Marines killed for no tactical gain. So the Corps did what institutions do. They quietly recognized Bender's actions, they gave him a Silver Star, and they made sure his example stayed confined to Fox Company's oral history. But here's what they couldn't classify, what they couldn't control. The survivors of Fox Company went home and told the story. To their families, to other veterans, to anyone who would listen. And the story spread. By the 1960s, Bender's body detail had become part of Marine Corps folklore. Training instructors would mention it, carefully, as an example of leadership under extreme conditions. Not as something to emulate, but as something to understand. The contradiction at the heart of Bender's actions. He violated standing orders and probably saved Fox Company in the process. Fast forward to today. The Marine Corps officially recovered 4,167 American remains from North Korea between 1990 and 1994. They're still searching. The Joint POW-MIA Accounting Command has teams that do nothing but look for remains from the Korean War. 75 years later, we're still going back for our dead. Bender knew something in 1950 that it took the core decades to fully acknowledge. How you treat your dead determines how the living fight. It's not about sentiment. It's not about emotion. It's about the fundamental compact that makes soldiers willing to walk into hell, the knowledge that their brothers won't leave them there. Now here's the part that never made it into any official history. After the war, Bender stayed in the Marines, made it to Sergeant Major, served in Vietnam, and in 1968 he was training young Marines headed for Khe Sanh, another surrounded position, another desperate defense. One of those Marines asked him, "Sergeant Major, what do we do if we get overrun? How do we know when to fall back?" And Bender told him about Toktong Pass, about the 48 bodies, about the choice he made to go get them. Then he said, "You don't get to decide when to fall back. You don't get to decide when it's hopeless. You stay and you fight and you trust that your brothers are doing the same thing. Because the minute you start calculating your own survival, the minute you start thinking about leaving someone behind, that's when you've already lost." That Marine survived Khe Sanh. He went on to become a colonel, and in 2003 he was commanding a battalion in Iraq when they got ambushed in Nasiriyah. 2 Marines killed, bodies in the open under fire. He ordered his men to recover them. They did, at significant risk. When asked why he made that call, he said, "Because a sergeant major once told me about Chosin." That's the real story of Elmer Bender. Not that he recovered 14 bodies at Chosin, but that he created a legacy that's still influencing how Marines fight today, 75 years later. The Marine Corps never officially endorsed what Bender did. They couldn't, but they never forgot it either. And neither should we, because Chosin wasn't just about surviving impossible odds. It was about the decisions men made that defined what those odds meant. Bender decided that even in the worst conditions warfare has ever produced, even when surrounded and freezing and dying, Americans don't abandon their dead. That's not sentiment. That's not emotion. That's the warrior ethos distilled to its purest form, and it's why Fox Company held Toktong Pass when every tactical manual said they should have been overrun. Technical Sergeant Elmer Bender died in 1989. He's buried in Arlington. Section 46. There's nothing on his headstone about the body detail, just his name, his rank, and his wars. But if you visit Fox Company reunions, if you talk to the Chosin few who are still with us, they'll tell you, Bender saved them all, not by killing Chinese soldiers, by refusing to leave Marines behind. That was the real battle at Chosin, and that's the battle we're still fighting today.